Okay, this is going to be a little bit lengthy, but I do believe it's something that needs to be talked about, okay, and understood. And for a lot of people that have already watched this documentary, they've heard this, but to understand how critical it is to understand this, I've always told everybody NWO, social engineering our society, and it really is. It's profiteering off the backs of others. It's not caring who you push down as long as you can make a profit on it for yourself. Okay? It's not caring. I mean, I've told people for so long now, we've lost care in our society. Okay? And it is the system itself that has led to the destruction. You're looking at, well, basically the self-destruction of mankind. The end goal is going to be major death, okay? And unfortunately, we're to a point now where this is almost like, let the bombs fall, let billions and billions of people die, and push the reset button. Because unless people really, truly take what's being said here seriously and open their damn eyes up and stop their childish behavior, this is not going to go away. We, the people, the human beings of this planet, have made it what it is. And only we, the people of this planet, can change this. And we will never change it through the mindset that you're running around with. You will only lead to your own death, your own self-demise through ignorance and dumbness. Anyhow, I think the name of the video fits. I thank him for it, Peter Joseph, for this documentary, because this is the real truth. I know it deep in my gut. The real truth has been told here. This is going to be a little bit lengthy, but if you want to know the real truth, and you want to know why there's so many millions and millions of men alone, and why women and men are acting the way they are, and why we're all divided, and why this is going on, where TFL came from, why MGTOW's here, why incels here, you got it. If you want to know all the answers to what's going on in this world and where this problem come from, then you better take the time to open your ears and pay attention to what's being said here. I'm going to play this. I'm going to mostly let it play through. I will stop at a couple of points, give a little bit of commentary, but outside of that, I'm going to let it play through. I've got this documentary in my favorited on my channel already, so you can watch it from beginning to end, and I would suggest that you take the time to do it. With that being said, let's go.
When I was a young man, growing up in New York City, I refused to pledge allegiance to the flag. Of course, I was sent to the principal's office, and he asked me, "Why don't you want to pledge allegiance? Everybody does." I said, "Everybody once believed the earth was flat, but that doesn't make it so." I explained that America owed everything it has to other cultures and other nations, and that I would rather pledge allegiance to the earth and everyone on it. Needless to say, it wasn't long before I left school entirely, and I set up a lab in my bedroom. There I began to learn about science and nature. I realized then that the universe is governed by laws, and that the human being, along with society itself, was not exempt from these laws. Then came the crash of 1929, which began what we now call the Great Depression. I found it difficult to understand why millions were out of work, homeless, starving, while all the factories were sitting there. The resources were unchanged. It was then that I realized that the rules of the economic game were inherently invalid. Shortly after came World War II, where various nations took turns systematically destroying each other. I later calculated that all the destruction and wasted resources spent on that war could have easily provided for every human need on the planet. Since that time, I have watched humanity set the stage for its own extinction. I have watched as the precious finite...
That is absolutely correct, and that's exactly where we're headed. It's to our own extinction, like the dinosaurs.
Resources are perpetually wasted and destroyed in the name of profit and free markets. I have watched the social values of society be reduced into a base artificiality of materialism and mindless consumption. And I have watched as the monetary powers control the political structure of supposedly free societies. I'm 94 years old now, and I'm afraid my disposition is the same as it was 75 years ago. This shit's got to go.
So you're a scientist, and somewhere along the way, hammered into your head is the inevitable nature versus nurture, and that's at least up there with Coke versus Pepsi or Greeks versus Trojans. So nature versus nurture, this by now utterly oversimplifying view of where influences on how a cell deals with an energy crisis, up to what makes us who we are on the most individualistic levels of personality. And what you've got is this complete false dichotomy built around nature as deterministic. At the very bottom of all the causality of life is DNA and the code of codes and the Holy Grail, and everything is driven by it. And at the other end, a much more social science perspective, which is we are social organisms, and biology is for slime molds. Humans are free of biology, and obviously both views are nonsense. What you see instead is it is virtually impossible to understand how biology works outside the context of environment. One of the most crazy-making yet widespread and potentially dangerous notions is, oh, that behavior is genetic. Now, what does that mean? It means all sorts of subtle stuff if you sort of know modern biology, but for most people out there, what it winds up meaning is a deterministic view of life, one rooted in biology and genetics. Genes equal things that can't be changed. Genes equal things that are inevitable and that you might as well not waste resources trying to fix, might as well not put societal energies into trying to improve because it's inevitable, it's unchangeable. And that is sheer nonsense.
It is widely thought that conditions like ADHD are genetically programmed, conditions like schizophrenia are genetically programmed. The truth is the opposite. Nothing is genetically programmed. They're very rare diseases. I mean, a small handful, extremely sparsely represented in the population, that are truly genetically determined. Most complex conditions might have a predisposition that is a genetic component, but a predisposition is not the same as a predetermination. The whole search for the source of diseases in the genome was doomed to failure before anybody even thought of it, because most diseases are not genetically predetermined. Heart disease, cancer, strokes, rheumatoid conditions, autoimmune conditions in general, mental health conditions, addictions, these are none of them genetically determined. Breast cancer, for example, out of 100 women with breast cancer, only 7 will carry the breast cancer genes. 93 do not. And out of 100 women who do have the genes, not all of them will get cancer.
Genes are not just things that make us behave in a particular way regardless of our environment. Genes give us different ways of responding to our environment. In fact, it looks as if some of the early childhood influences of the kind of child rearing affects gene expression, actually turning on and off different genes to put you on a different developmental track, which may suit the kind of world you've got to deal with.
So, for example, a study done in Montreal with suicide victims looked at autopsies of the brains of these people. And it turned out that if a suicide victim, these are usually young adults, had been abused as children, the abuse actually caused a genetic change in the brain that was absent in the brains of people who had not been abused. That's an epigenetic effect. Epi means on top of, so that the epigenetic influence is what happens environmentally to either activate or deactivate certain genes.
In New Zealand, there's a study that was done in a town called Dunedin, in which a few thousand individuals were studied from birth up to into their 20s. What they found was that they could identify a genetic mutation, an abnormal gene, which did have some relation to the predisposition to commit violence, but only if the individual had also been subjected to severe child abuse. In other words, a child with this abnormal gene would be no more likely to be violent than anybody else, and in fact they actually had a lower rate of violence than people with normal genes, as long as they weren't abused as children.
Great additional example of the ways in which genes are not be-all, end-all. Fancy technique where you can take a specific gene out of a mouse, that mouse and its descendants will not have that gene. You have knocked out that gene. So there's this one gene that codes for a protein that has something to do with learning and memory, and this fabulous demonstration, knock out that gene and you have a mouse that doesn't learn as well. Ooh, a genetic basis for intelligence. What was much less appreciated in that landmark study that got picked up by the media left and right is take those genetically impaired mice and raise them in a much more enriched, stimulating environment than your normal mice in a lab cage, and they completely overcame that deficit. So when one says in a contemporary sense that, oh, this behavior is genetic, to the extent that that's even a valid sort of phrase to use, what you're saying is there is a genetic contribution to how this organism responds to environment. Genes may influence the readiness with which an organism will deal with a certain environmental challenge. You know, that's not the version most people have in their minds. And not to be too soapboxing, but run with the old sort of version of it's genetic, and it's not that far from a history of eugenics and things of that sort. It's a widespread misconception, and it's a potentially fairly dangerous one.
One reason that the sort of biological explanation for violence, one reason that hypothesis is potentially dangerous, it's not just misleading, it can really do harm, is because if you believe that, you could very easily say, well, there's nothing we can do to change the predisposition people have to becoming violent. All we can do if somebody becomes violent is punish them, lock them up or execute them. But we don't need to worry about changing the social environment or the social preconditions that may lead people to become violent, because that's irrelevant.
The genetic argument allows us the luxury of ignoring past and present historical and social factors.
Which is exactly what's going on. People are ignoring the real truth when it's in their face and wanting to go with whatever they believe even if what they believe is complete hogwash.
And in the words of Louis Menand, he wrote in the New Yorker, very astutely, he said, "It's all in the genes, an explanation for the way things are that does not threaten the way things are. Why should someone feel unhappy or engage in antisocial behavior when that person is living in the freest and most prosperous nation on earth? It can't be the system. There must be a flaw in the wiring somewhere," which is a good way of putting it. So the genetic argument is simply a cop-out, which allows us to ignore the social and economic and political factors.
Right, exactly. People love to use the genetics, the DNA, as a cop-out to get around, to ignore the real truth.
That in fact underlie many troublesome behaviors. Addictions are usually considered to be a drug-related issue, but looking at it more broadly, I define addiction as any behavior that is associated with craving, with temporary relief, and with long-term negative consequences, along with an impairment of control over it, so that the person wishes to give it up or promises to do so, but can't follow through. And when you understand that, then you can see that there are many more addictions than simply those related to drugs. So there's workaholism, there's the addiction to shopping, to the internet, to video games. There's the addiction to power. People have power, but they want more and more and more. Nothing is ever enough for them. Acquisition, corporations that must own more and more. The addiction to oil, or at least to the wealth and to the products made accessible to us by oil. Look at the negative consequences on the environment. We're destroying the very earth that we inhabit for the sake of that addiction. Now, these addictions are far more devastating in their social consequences than the cocaine or heroin habits of my downtown East Side patients. Yet they're rewarded and considered to be respectable. The tobacco company executive that shows a higher profit will get a much bigger reward. He doesn't face any negative consequences legally or otherwise. In fact, he's a respected member of the board of several other corporations. But tobacco smoke-related diseases kill 5.5 million people around the world every year. In the United States, they kill 400,000 people a year. And these people are addicted to what? To profit. To such a degree are they addicted that they're actually in denial about the impact of their activities, which is typical for addicts, is denial. And that's a respectable one. It's respectable to be addicted to profit no matter what the cost. So what is acceptable and what is respectable is a highly arbitrary phenomenon in our society. And it seems like the greater the harm, the more respectable the addiction. There's a general myth that drugs in themselves are addictive. In fact, the war on drugs is predicated on the idea that if you interdict the sources of drugs, you can deal with addiction that way. Now, if we understand addiction in a broader sense, we see that nothing in itself is addictive. No substance, no drug is by itself addictive, and no behavior is by itself addictive. Many people can go shopping without becoming shopaholics. Not everybody becomes a food addict. Not everyone who drinks a glass of wine becomes an alcoholic. So the real issue is what makes people susceptible, because it's the combination of a susceptible individual and the potentially addictive substance or behavior that actually then makes for full flowering of addiction. In short, it's not the drug that's addictive, it's the question of the susceptibility of the individual.
Now, I agree with that, but just remember this. The war on drugs, one more time, is profiting off the backs of others. It sure is. We create the problem, we pipe the drugs in, we make a law saying you can't have what we brought in after we made the law. We, the people who made the law, bring it in. We pass it to you. You get arrested for having what we brought in, as we know we're going to arrest you for having what we gave you. And then therefore you're in a prison system doing free labor that we're also making money on. So see, we grew the drug, profited off the drug, locked you up, and profited off your labor, profiting off the backs of others.
Being addicted to a particular substance or behavior. If we wish to understand what then makes some people susceptible, we actually have to look at their life experience. The old idea, although it's old, but it's still broadly held, that addictions are due to some genetic cause is simply scientifically untenable. What the case is actually is that certain life experiences make people susceptible. Life experiences that not only shape the person's personality and psychological needs, but also their very brains in certain ways. And that process begins in utero. It's been shown, for example, that if you stress mothers during pregnancy, their children are more likely to have traits that predispose them to addictions. And that's because development is shaped by the psychological and social environment. So the biology of human beings is very much affected by and programmed by their life experiences beginning in utero.
Environment does not begin at birth. Environment begins as soon as you have an environment. As soon as you are a fetus, you are subject to whatever information is coming through mom's circulations, hormones, levels of nutrients. Great landmark example of this, something called the Dutch hunger winter. 1944, Nazis occupying Holland. For a bunch of reasons, they decide to take all the food and divert it to Germany. For 3 months, everybody there is starving. Tens of thousands of people starve to death. What the Dutch hunger winter effect is, if you were a second or third trimester fetus during the starvation, your body learned something very unique during that time. As it turns out, second, third trimester, something that your body is going about trying to learn about the environment is, well, how menacing of a place is it out there? How plentiful? How much nutrients am I getting by way of mom's circulation? Be a fetus who is starving during that time, and your body programs forever after to be really, really, really stingy with your sugar and fat, and what you do is you store every bit of it. Be a Dutch hunger winter fetus, and half a century later, everything else being equal, you are more likely to have high blood pressure, obesity, or metabolic syndrome. That is environment coming in a very unexpected place.
You can stress animals in a laboratory when they're pregnant, and their offspring will be more likely to use cocaine and alcohol as adults. You can stress human mothers. For example, in a British study, women who are abused in pregnancy will have higher levels of the stress hormone cortisol in their placenta at birth, and their children are more likely to have conditions that predispose them to addictions by age 7 or 8. So in utero stress already prepares the ground for all kinds of mental health issues. An Israeli study done prior on children born to mothers who were pregnant prior to the onset of the 1967 war. These women, of course, are very stressed, and their offspring have a higher incidence of schizophrenia than the average cohort. So there's plenty of evidence now that prenatal effects have a huge impact on the developing human being. The point about human development, and specifically human brain development, is that it occurs mostly under the impact of the environment and mostly after birth. Now, if you compare us to a horse, which can run on the first day of life, we see that we are very undeveloped. We can't muster that much neurological coordination, balance, muscle strength, visual acuity until a year and a half, 2 years. And that's because the brain development that in the horse happens in the safety of the womb, in a human being has to happen after birth. And that has to do with simple evolutionary logic. As the head gets larger, which is what makes us into human beings, the burgeoning of the forebrain is what creates the human species, actually. At the same time, we walk on 2 legs, so our pelvis narrows to accommodate that. So now we have a narrower pelvis, a larger head. Bingo, we have to be born prematurely. And that means that the brain development that in other animals occurs in utero, in us, occurs after birth. And much of that under the impact of the environment. And the concept of neural Darwinism simply means that the circuits that get the appropriate input from the environment will develop optimally, and the ones that don't will either not develop optimally or perhaps not at all. If you take a child with perfectly good eyes at birth and you put him in a dark room for 5 years, he'll be blind thereafter for the rest of his life, because the circuits of vision require light waves for their development. And without that, even the rudimentary circuits present and active at birth will atrophy and die. and new ones will not develop. There's a significant way in which early experiences shape adult behavior, and even and especially early experiences for which there's no recall memory. It turns out that there are two kinds of memory. There is explicit memory, which is recall. This is when you can call back facts, details, episodes, circumstances. But the structure in the brain, which is called the hippocampus, which encodes recall memory, it doesn't even begin to develop fully until a year and a half, and it's not fully developed till much later, which is why hardly anybody has any recall memory prior to 18 months. But there's another kind of memory, which is called implicit memory, which is in fact an emotional memory, where the emotional impact and the interpretation that the child makes of those emotional experiences is ingrained in the brain in the form of nerve circuits ready to fire without specific recall. So to give you a clear example, people who are adopted have a lifelong sense of rejection very often. They can't recall the adoption, they can't recall the separation from birth mother, because there's nothing there to recall with. But the emotional memory of separation and rejection is deeply embedded in their brains. Hence, they're much more likely to experience a sense of rejection and a great emotional upset when they perceive themselves as being rejected than other people. That's not unique to people who are adopted, but it's particularly strong in them because of this function of implicit memory. People who are addicted, given that they, according to all the research literature, certainly in my experience, the hardcore addicts virtually were all significantly abused as children or suffered severe emotional loss. Their emotional or implicit memories are those of a world that's not safe and not helpful, caregivers who are not to be trusted, and relationships that are not safe enough to open up too vulnerably. And hence their responses tend to be to keep themselves separate from really intimate relationships, not to trust caregivers, doctors, and other people who are trying to help them, and generally see the world as an unsafe place. And that's strictly a function of implicit memory, which sometimes has to do with incidents they don't even recall. Infants who are born premature are often in incubators and various types of gadgetry and machinery for weeks and perhaps months. It's now known that if these children are touched and stroked on the back for just 10 minutes a day, that promotes their brain development. So human touch is essential for development. And in fact, infants who are never picked up will actually die. That's how much of a fundamental need being held is to human beings. In our society, there's an unfortunate tendency to tell parents not to pick up their kids, not to hold them, not to pick up babies who are crying for fear of spoiling them, or to encourage them to sleep through the night. You don't pick them up, which is just the opposite of what the child needs. And these children might go back to sleep because they give up and their brains just shut down as a way of defending against the vulnerability of being abandoned really by their parents. But their implicit memories will be that of a world that doesn't give a damn.
A lot of these differences are structured very early in life. In a way, if you like, the parental experience of adversity, how tough life is or how easy it is passed on to children, whether through maternal depression or parents being bad-tempered with their kids because they've had a hard day or just being too tired at the end of the day. And these have very powerful effects, programming children's development, which we know a lot about now. But that's early sensitivity isn't just an evolutionary mistake. It exists again in many different species. Even seedlings, there's an early adaptive process to the kind of environment they're growing up in. But for humans, the adaptation is to the quality of social relations. And so early life, how nurturing or how much conflict, how much attention you get, is a taster of the kind of world you may be growing up in. Are you growing up in a world where you have to fight for what you can get, watch your back, fend for yourself, learn not to trust others? Or are you growing up in a society where you depend on reciprocity, mutuality, cooperation, where empathy is important, where your security depends on good relations with other people?
We're not growing up in a world that has empathy anymore. We're growing up in a very, very vile, sick world. It is our society that's done this to us.
And that needs a very different emotional and cognitive development, and that's what the early sensitivity is about. And parenting is almost, quite unconsciously, a system for passing on that experience to children of the kind of world they're in.
The great British child psychiatrist D.W. Winnicott said that fundamentally two things can go wrong in childhood. One is when things happen that shouldn't happen, and then things that should happen but don't. And the first category is the traumatic and abusive and abandonment experiences of my downtown East Side patients and of many addicts. That's what shouldn't happen but did. But then there is the non-stressed, attuned, non-distracted attention of the parent that every child needs, that very often children don't get. They're not abused, they're not neglected, and they're not traumatized. But what should happen, the presence of the emotionally available, nurturing parent, just is not available to them because of the stresses in our society and the parenting environment. And the psychologist Alan Shore calls that proximal abandonment, where the parent is physically present but emotionally absent.
I have spent roughly the last 40 years of my life working with the most violent people our society produces, murderers, rapists, and so on, in an attempt to understand what causes this violence. I discovered that the most violent of the criminals in our prisons had themselves been victims of a degree of child abuse that was beyond the scale of what I ever thought of applying the term child abuse to. I had no idea of the depth of the depravity with which children in our society are all too often treated. The most violent people I saw were themselves the survivors of their own attempted murder, often at the hands of their parents or other people in their social environment.
Let's just think about what they've just said. It's all correct. But yet you all want to claim we love our children. We're concerned. That's our future. That's right. That's our next generation. And in reality, what you're saying is complete lies. That's really what you're saying. Of course, that's not 100% across the board, but really think about what you just heard.
Or were the survivors of family members who'd been killed, their closest family members, by other people.
The Buddha argued that everything depends on everything else. He says the one contains the many and the many contains the one. That you can't understand anything in isolation from its environment. The leaf contains the sun, the sky, and the earth, obviously. This has not been shown to be true, of course, all around, and specifically when it comes to human development. The modern scientific term for it is the biopsychosocial nature of human development, which says that the biology of human beings depends very much on their interaction with the social and psychological environment. And specifically, the psychiatrist and researcher Daniel Siegel at the University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA, has coined the phrase interpersonal neurobiology, which means to say that the way that our nervous system functions depends very much on our personal relationships. In the first place with the parenting caregivers, and in the second place with other important attachment figures in our lives, and in the third place with our entire culture. So that you can't separate the neurological functioning of a human being from the environment in which he or she grew up in and continues to exist in. And this is true throughout the life cycle. It's particularly true when you're dependent and helpless and your brain is developing, but it's true even in adults and even at the end of life.
Human beings have lived in almost every kind of society, from the most egalitarian, hunting and gathering societies seem to have been very egalitarian, for instance.
This part here is very critical, and I think people really need to listen hard to what's being said here, because I know they're 100% correct. This is the real truth in your face.
Based on food sharing, gift exchange.
Small bands of people living predominantly off of foraging, but a little bit of hunting, predominantly among people you have at the least known your entire life, if not surrounded by third cousins or closer, in a world in which there is a great deal of fluidity between different groups, in a world in which there is not a whole lot in terms of material culture. This is how humans have spent most of their hominid history. And no surprise, that makes for a very different world. One of the things you get as a result of that is far less violence. Organized group violence is not something that occurred at that time of human history, and that seems quite clear. So where did we go wrong?
Violence is not universal. It's not symmetrically distributed throughout the human race. There is a huge variation in the amount of violence in different societies. There are some societies that have virtually no violence. There are others that destroy themselves. Some of the Anabaptist religious groups that are complete strict pacifists, like the Amish, the Mennonites, the Hutterites. Among some of these groups, the Hutterites, there are no recorded cases of homicide. During our major wars, like World War II, where people were being drafted, they would refuse to serve in the military. They would go to prison rather than serve in the military. In the kibbutzim in Israel, the level of violence is so low that the criminal courts there will often send violent offenders, people who've committed crimes, to live on the kibbutzim in order to learn how to live a nonviolent life, because that's the way people live there.
So we are amply shaped by society. Our societies, in the broader sense, including our theological, our metaphysical, our linguistic influences, etc., our societies help shape us as to whether or not we think life is basically about sin or about beauty, whether the afterlife will carry a price for how we live our lives or if it's irrelevant. In a broad sort of way, different large societies could be termed as individualistic or collectivist, and you get very different people and different mindsets, and I suspect different brains coming along with that. We in America are in one of the most individualistic of societies, and capitalism being a system that allows you to go higher and higher up a potential pyramid, and the deal is it comes with fewer and fewer safety nets. By definition, the more stratified a society is, the fewer people you have as peers, the fewer people with whom you have symmetrical, reciprocal relationships, and instead all you have are differing spots and endless hierarchies. And a world in which you have few reciprocal partners is a world with a lot less altruism. Alright, so this brings us to a total impossible juncture, which is to try to make sense in perspective of science as to what the nature is of human nature. You know, on a certain level...
Listen close. Listen real close.
The nature of our nature is not to be particularly constrained by our nature. We come up with more social variability than any species out there, more systems of belief, of styles of family structures, of ways of raising children. The capacity for variety that we have is extraordinary.
In a society which is predicated on competition and really very often the ruthless exploitation of one human being by another, the profiteering of other people's problems.
Correct. PUA. Profiteering off other people's others. Problem, reaction, solution. False flags, military exercise drills that never happened. Profiting off the backs of others.
And very often, the creation of problems for the purpose of profiteering.
There you go. The creation of problems by your very leaders. The creation of a problem for profiteering, for selfish gain. A problem that never existed is created deliberately.
The ruling ideology will very often justify that behavior by appeals to some fundamental and unalterable human nature. So the myth in our society is that people are competitive by nature and that they're individualistic and that they're selfish. The real reality is quite the opposite. We have certain human needs.
There you go. Now the real is Not so. We have certain human needs. Now listen to this. It's very vital you listen and understand.
The way that you can talk about human nature concretely is by recognizing that there's certain human needs. We have a human need for companionship and for close contact.
For companionship and close contact. And what does your leader of the men's rights movement tell you? That's right. There's going to be a significant number of men that will never ever be able to have what he just said. Let's play this again.
The real reality is quite the opposite. We have certain human needs. The only way that you can talk about human nature concretely is by recognizing that there's certain human needs.
Remember, it's human needs. That includes men and women. Not just women, not one-sidedness. It's never been one-sided. Human. Men are just as human as women. But you got 30 years of male shaming and male bashing. Don't we? Yeah. You even have... No, we don't have a call from. Okay, so we even have your leaders of the men's rights movement, Karen Stroud, okay, telling men openly that there's going to be a significant number of men that no women will give the time of day to.
A human need for companionship and for close contact, to be loved, to be attached to be accepted, to be seen, to be received for who we are. If those needs are met, we develop into people who are compassionate and cooperative and who have empathy for other people.
Right. When all them needs are met, this is exactly what happens. But when them needs are denied, this is what happens.
So, the opposite that we often see in our society is in fact the distortion of human nature, precisely because so few people have their needs met. So, yes, you can talk about a human nature, but only in the sense of basic human needs that are instinctively evoked, or I should say certain human needs that lead to certain traits if they are met, and a different set of traits if they're denied.
That which is sort of like natural law, huh? When denied.
So, when we recognize the fact that the human organism, which has a great deal of adaptive flexibility, allowing us to survive in many different conditions, is also rigidly programmed for certain environmental requirements or human needs, a social imperative.
And remember, the human needs, and they're showing the female face, isn't just the female. In our male bashing society, we're going to say the only human is a woman. The only one that has needs is a woman. That's deliberately done to destroy your society. And that's exactly what it's done. That's exactly what Karen Stroud told yourself. A specific number of men that will be denied what every human being needs.
Begins to emerge. Just as our bodies require physical nutrients, the human brain demands positive forms of environmental stimulus at all stages of development, while also needing to be protected from other negative forms of stimulus. And if things that should happen do not, or if things that shouldn't happen do, it is now apparent that the door can be opened for not only a cascade of mental and physical diseases, but many detrimental human behaviors as well.
Behavior, which is something I've addressed so many times. Your behaviors. Your behaviors come from this very thing. So I'm going to back up and we're going to replay this little part because it's vital that you hear this.
Of one human being by another, the profiteering of other people's problems, and very often the creation of problems for the purpose of profiteering. The ruling ideology will very often justify that behavior by appeals to some fundamental and unalterable human nature. So the myth in our society is that people are competitive by nature and that they're individualistic and that they're selfish. The real reality is quite the opposite. We have certain human needs. The only way that you can talk about human nature concretely is by recognizing that there's certain human needs. We have a human need for compassion.
We have a human need for compassion. Now this is the part I'm going to stop one more time. Incel, TFL, Forever Alone. That's right. Men going their own way. Women going their own way. 100% social engineering your society. 100%. And Karen Stroud just helped to escalate this when she made her statement on there's a significant number of men that no woman will ever want anything to do with. But yet, men and women alike are human beings. Human beings ain't just one gender. That's been deliberately done.
Companionship and for close contact, to be loved, to be attached to be accepted, to be seen, to be received for who we are. If those needs are met, we develop into people who are compassionate and cooperative and who have empathy for other people. So the opposite that we often see in our society is in fact the distortion of human nature, precisely because so few people have their needs met. So yes, you can talk about a human nature, but only in the sense of basic human needs that are instinctively evoked, or I should say certain human needs that lead to certain traits if they are met, and a different set of traits if they're denied.
So, when we recognize the fact that the human organism, which has a great deal of adaptive flexibility, allowing us to survive in many different conditions, is also rigidly programmed for certain environmental requirements or human needs, a social imperative begins to emerge. Just as our bodies require physical nutrients, the human brain demands positive forms of environmental stimulus at all stages of development, while also needing to be protected from other negative forms of stimulus. And if things that should happen do not, or if things that shouldn't happen do, it is now apparent that the door can be opened for not only a cascade of mental and physical diseases, but many detrimental human behaviors as well. So as we turn our perspective now outward and take account for the state of affairs today, we must ask the question, is the condition we have created in the modern world actually supporting our health? Is the bedrock of our socioeconomic system acting as a positive force for human and social development and progress? Or is the foundational gravitation of our society actually going against the core evolutionary requirements needed to create and maintain our personal and social well-being?
So one might ask, where did this all begin? What we have today, really a world in a state of cumulative collapse. You get it started with John Locke. And John Locke introduces property, and he has three provisos for just private right and property. And the three provisos are that there must be enough left over for others, and that you must not let it spoil, and that you, most of all, must mix your labor with it. It seems justified. You mix your labor with the world, then you're entitled to the product, and as long as there's enough left over for others, and as long as it doesn't spoil, you don't allow anything to go to waste, that's okay. Well, he spends a long time of his famous treatise of government, and it's since been the canonical text for economic and political and legal understanding. It's still at the classic text of study. Well, what he did is, after he gives the provisos, and you're almost thinking at the time whether you're for private property or not, he's given a very good and plausible and powerful defense of private property here. Well, he drops them. He drops them like that, right in one sentence. He says, well, once the introduction of money came in by men's tacit consent, then it became, and he doesn't say all the provisos are
That's right. Once the introduction of money came in, the root of all evil. That's right. When you hear money being used as the word of the root of all evil, that's not a lie. That's true. It's right here in your face.
Canceled, erased, but that's what happens. So now we have not product and your property earned by your own labor. Oh no, money buys labor now. There's no longer a consideration of whether there's enough left over for others. There's no longer a consideration of whether it spoils, because he says, well, money's like silver and gold can't spoil, therefore monies can't be responsible for waste, which is ridiculous. We're not talking about money and silver, we're talking about what its effects are. It's one non sequitur after another. Just the most startling logical legerdemain that he gets away with here. But it fits the interests of capital owners. Then Adam Smith comes along, and what he adds is the religion to this. Locke started with God made it all this way. This is God's right. And now we get also with Smith coming along and says it's not only God's, I mean, he's not saying this, but this is what's happening philosophically in principle. He's saying it's not only a question of private property, that's all now presupposed, is given. And that there's money investors that buy labor, given. That there's no limit to how much they can buy of other men's labor, how much they can accumulate, how much inequality, that's all given now. And so he comes along, and what his big idea is, and again, it's just introduced in parentheses en passant. You know, when people put out the goods for sale and others, you know, the supply, and other people buy them with the demand and so forth, how do we have supply equaling demand or demand equaling supply? How can they come into equilibrium? And that is one of the central notions of economics, is how do they come into equilibrium? And he says it's the invisible hand of the market that brings them into equilibrium. So now we have God as actually immanent. He just didn't give the rights to property and how, you know, all its wherewithal and its natural rights of doing all that Locke said. Now we have the system itself as God. In fact, Smith says, when he talks, and you'll never find this quote again, you have to read the whole of the Inquiry into the Wealth of Nations. He says, the scantiness of subsistence sets limits to the reproduction of the poor, and that nature can deal with this in no other way than elimination of their children.
That's right. The reproduction of poor. So now we have used a monetary thing, a man-made thing, to say to other people that we denied having this man-made creation called money, the tool, that we now have a right to kill you. This is eugenics. This is the practice of evil, the root of all evil, money. Now we're using that to justify to our own sick brains that it's our right to take other human life.
So he anticipated evolutionary theory in the worst sense. This is well before Darwin. And so he called them the race of laborers. So you can see there was inherent racism built in here. There was an inherent acceptance, life blindness to kill innumerable children.
Yes, like Planned Parenthood. And racism, the black people. There you go. One more time, in your face.
And he thought, well, that's the invisible hand making supply meet demand and demand meet supply. So see how wise God is. So you can see a lot of the really virulent, life-destructive, eco-genocidal things that are going on now have, in a way, a thought gene back in Smith too.
When we reflect on the original concept of the so-called free market capitalist system, as initiated by early economic philosophers such as Adam Smith, we see that the original intent of a market was based around real, tangible, life-supporting goods for trade. Adam Smith never fathomed that the most profitable economic sector on the planet would eventually be in the arena of financial trading, or so-called investment, where money itself is simply gained by the movement of other money in an arbitrary game which holds zero productive merit to society. Yet, regardless of Smith's intent, the door for such seemingly anomalous advents was left wide open by one fundamental tenet of this theory. Money is treated as a commodity in and of itself. Today, in every economy of the world, regardless of the social system they claim, money is pursued for the sake of money and nothing else. The underlying idea, which was mysteriously qualified by Adam Smith with his religious declaration of the invisible hand, is that the narrow, self-interested pursuit of this fictional commodity will somehow magically manifest human and social well-being and progress. The reality is that the monetary incentive interest, or what some have termed the money sequence of value, has now completely decoupled from the foundational life interest, which could be termed the life sequence of value.
What has happened is that there's a complete confusion in economic doctrine between those two sequences. They think that the money sequence of value delivers the life sequence of value, and that's why they say if more goods are sold, if GDPs rise and so forth, therefore there'll be more well-being, enhanced well-being. We take the GDP to be basically our indicator of social health.
Yeah, there'll be more wealth, there'll be more, life will be better for the people with money. And for the people we deny money to, a man-made thing too, well, life won't be better for them. We get to kill them, right? We get to look down on them. We get to think we're gods. Very sick, psychotic, psychopathic. I would root for doing away with money completely. Completely demolish all money. And go back to the old system. At least then you'll have care, you'll have empathy, and there won't be none of this hogwash that you're seeing. Now, do you see how TFL has been created by your society?
Well, there you see the confusion. It's talking about money sequences of value. That is all the receipts, all the revenues that are derived from selling goods. And they're confusing that with life reproduction. So that you have built right into this thing from the beginning is a complete conflation of the money and life sequences of value. So we're dealing with a kind of structured delusion that becomes more and more deadly as the money sequence decouples from producing anything at all. So it's a system disorder, and the system disorder seems to be fatal.
It is fatal. What you're looking at is the extinction of mankind. That's where we're going. Just like with the dinosaurs. You're going to your own self-extinction through ignorance and dumbness, through your ability to have more for yourself, through your ability to not care about others. That's right, all for the root of all evil, money. It is so in your face. This is all so concretely true, what I've just showed you. And this is where TFL came from. This is where incel come from. This is where all your problems come from, your military exercise drills, your false flags, 9/11, Sandy Crook. All of them was for profiting off the backs of others. Anyhow, I hope you got the gist of why I done this. With that, I'm out of here because this is already long enough.